You know, what most people misunderstand is that when an empath finally cuts someone off, it rarely begins in that moment. It begins much earlier, long before the silence, long before the distance, long before the disappearance that others label as sudden. What you're actually witnessing is the final stage of a process that has been unfolding quietly, often invisibly for weeks, months, sometimes even years. Empaths are not quick reactors. They are processors. They don't meet every slight with confrontation or every disappointment with a boundary. Instead, they observe, they feel, and most importantly, they absorb. That absorption is where everything starts to accumulate. Every dismissive comment, every broken promise, every subtle shift in tone, these are not dismissed or forgotten. They are registered, stored, and analyzed beneath the surface. And here's where it becomes psychologically significant. Empaths tend to give people the benefit of the doubt far longer than is rational. They operate from a framework that assumes depth in others because they themselves are deep. They assume self-awareness in others because they themselves are self-aware. So when something feels off, they don't immediately conclude this person is wrong. They ask, what am I missing? What are they going through? Can I understand this better? This creates a delay between the experience of harm and the expression of it. Instead of reacting outwardly, they turn inward. They rationalize, they reframe. They justify behavior that in many cases should not be justified. And while this may look like patience or emotional maturity on the surface, it has a hidden cost. Because every time an empath chooses understanding over acknowledgement of harm, they are adding weight to an internal scale that no one else can see. That scale doesn't reset. It doesn't forget. It builds. Now, from the outside, this is where the confusion begins because the empath is still showing up. They're still listening, still engaging, still offering support. There are no dramatic confrontations, no ultimatums, no visible signs that something is breaking down. So the other person assumes everything is fine. In fact, they often believe the relationship is stable precisely because the empath isn't reacting in obvious ways. But stability is not what's actually happening. What's happening is accumulation without release. Over time, this creates a kind of emotional compression. Think of it as pressure building in a sealed environment. Every unspoken frustration, every overlooked boundary, every moment of emotional imbalance adds to that pressure. And because the empath isn't venting it outwardly, it intensifies internally. Eventually, something shifts, and it's rarely triggered by a major event. More often, it's something small, almost insignificant on its own. A comment, a tone, a repeated pattern that finally clicks into place. But the reason that small moment matters is because it doesn't stand alone. It connects all the previous moments into a single, undeniable pattern. That's the moment of recognition, not reaction recognition. It's when the empath stops asking, what if I'm misunderstanding this, and starts seeing, no, this is exactly what it is. And once that clarity sets in, the internal narrative changes. The energy that was once used to excuse, to understand, to hold space, it's no longer available for that purpose. And here's the part that people often misinterpret. When the empath withdraws at this stage, it looks immediate. It looks like a switch flipped overnight. One day they're present, the next day they're distant or gone. But what's actually happening is not sudden at all. It's the release of everything that was never expressed. All the conversations they rehearsed but never had. All the boundaries they considered but never enforced. All the realizations they reached but never verbalized. They don't come out gradually. They come out all at once in the form of detachment. And detachment in this context is not emotional volatility. It's an emotional conclusion. There's no need for a dramatic explanation because in the empath's mind, the explanation has already been processed 100 times over. They're not leaving to make a point. They're leaving because the point has already been made internally, repeatedly, and ignored externally. So when someone says, you cut me off without warning, what they're really saying is, I didn't see the warning. And in many cases, that's true. Because the warnings weren't loud, they weren't confrontational. They were subtle shifts, less enthusiasm, less availability, quieter energy, signals that are easy to miss if you're not paying close attention. But for the empath, those signals were the final attempts at recalibration. And when they go unnoticed, it confirms something deeper. Not just that the behavior won't change, but that it isn't even being seen. At that point, continuing the connection doesn't feel like loyalty. It feels like self-neglect. So the cutoff isn't impulsive. It's the final step in a long, disciplined restraint. It's what happens when patience reaches its limit and awareness takes its place. And if there's one thing to take from this, it's this. When an empath goes silent, it's not because they didn't have anything to say, because they already said everything that mattered, just not out loud. You know, once that silent accumulation reaches a certain threshold, something deeper begins to happen. Something that isn't as visible as frustration or conflict, but far more decisive. The empath starts to run out of emotional energy. And this isn't the kind of tiredness that a good night's sleep fixes. This is depletion at the level of identity, where the very traits that define them, their patience, their empathy, their willingness to understand, begins to feel strained under constant demand. Empaths are by nature generous with their attention. They listen longer, forgive faster, and invest more deeply than most. But what often goes unnoticed is that this level of giving requires a continuous output of psychological energy. Every time they regulate someone else's emotions, every time they absorb tension to keep the peace, every time they choose understanding over reaction, they are spending something internal. Now, in a balanced relationship, that energy is replenished. There's reciprocity, there's acknowledgement, there's a sense that what's being given is also being valued and in some form returned. But when that balance doesn't exist, when the empath becomes the consistent source of support without receiving it, the system begins to break down. At first, the empath compensates. They tell themselves to be more patient, more understanding, more flexible. They adjust their expectations. You know, they minimize their own needs in order to maintain the connection. And for a while, this works. It allows the relationship to continue without open conflict. But underneath that surface, something critical is happening. The empath is slowly disconnecting from their own emotional reserves. This is where emotional exhaustion takes root, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a gradual erosion. The things that once felt natural, checking in, offering support, engaging in conversation, started to feel heavy. Not because the empath has changed, but because the cost of showing up has increased beyond what they can sustain. And here's the important distinction. Emotional exhaustion in empaths doesn't usually present as anger. It presents as withdrawal. They don't lash out. They don't escalate. They become quieter, less reactive, less available. It's a subtle shift, but it signals something significant. The energy that once flowed outward is now being conserved, often unconsciously, because there simply isn't enough left to give. From the outside, this can be misread. People assume the empath is becoming distant, cold, or disinterested, but that interpretation misses the underlying reality. The empath isn't pulling away because they don't care. They're pulling away because continuing to care in the same way is no longer sustainable. But, at a certain point, they reach what you could call a point of no return, not in the sense that they've made a dramatic decision, but in the sense that their internal system has recalibrated. The idea of continuing the relationship in its current form no longer feels manageable. And when that realization sets in, something shifts in how they approach the connection. They stop trying to fix it. This is a critical moment because for most of the relationship, the empath has been in a problem-solving mode. They've been adjusting, analyzing, finding ways to make things work. But emotional exhaustion removes the capacity for that. It's not a choice, it's a limitation. The same way a muscle stops functioning after being overused, the empath's emotional bandwidth simply isn't there anymore. And when there's no energy left to repair, explain, or negotiate, the idea of having one more conversation, one more attempt to resolve things feels overwhelming rather than productive. So instead of engaging in a process they know they can't sustain, they choose the only option that preserves what little energy they have left. They disengage. Now, to the other person, this can feel abrupt. There may not be a long explanation or a drawn-out discussion. There may not be a clear moment where everything is laid out. But what's important to understand is that the empath isn't avoiding the conversation out of indifference. They're avoiding it because they've already had it internally multiple times, and each time it led to the same conclusion. Nothing changes at this stage. Cutting someone off is not an act of punishment. It's not about teaching a lesson or making a statement. It's about survival. It's about recognizing that continuing the relationship would require energy they no longer have, and sacrificing themselves themselves to maintain it is no longer an option. There's also a philosophical layer to this. When an empath reaches emotional exhaustion, they're forced to confront a fundamental truth. Empathy without limits becomes self-destructive. And once that truth is fully understood, not intellectually, but experientially, it changes how they operate. They begin to see that preserving their own stability is not selfish, it's necessary. So the cutoff when it happens is not fueled by resentment. It's fueled by clarity, a quiet, steady recognition that the cost of staying has exceeded the value of the connection. And if you're looking at this from the outside, trying to understand why it feels so final, it's because by the time the empath leaves, they're not debating the decision anymore. They're executing it. You know, the emotional process that would normally accompany a breakup or a separation has already been completed internally. What remains is action, and that action is often simple, direct, and irreversible. Not because the empath lacks compassion, but because they finally learned that compassion without boundaries will eventually consume the very person trying to offer it. So when an empath walks away without a long explanation, it's not a failure of communication. It's the result of exhaustion reaching its limit and self-preservation finally taking priority. And the reality is this: people don't leave when they stop caring. They leave when caring starts to cost them more than they can afford to lose. After the exhaustion sets in, after the energy has been drained and the effort no longer feels sustainable, the empath enters a phase that is far less emotional and far more cognitive. This is where something fundamentally changes, not in how they feel, but in how they see. Because for most of the relationship, their decisions were guided by hope. Hope that things would improve. Hope that the other person would become more aware, more consistent, more aligned. Hope that the version of the person they could see beneath the surface would eventually become the version that showed up in reality. And hope is powerful. It allows people to endure far more than they otherwise would. You know, it stretches patience. It justifies delay. It keeps the empath engaged long after the evidence suggests they should step back. But hope has a limit. And when it starts to collapse, it doesn't do so gradually. It gives way to something much sharper. Clarity. Clarity is different from emotion. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't soften. And it doesn't look for exceptions. It simply observes what is without distortion. And when an empath reaches this point, they begin to see patterns that were previously blurred by their own willingness to understand. The same behaviors they once excused now appear consistent. The same apologies they once accepted now feel repetitive. The same dynamics they tried to fix now reveal themselves as fixed. This is where the internal dialogue changes. It's no longer maybe they didn't mean it, or maybe this is just a phase. It becomes this is who they are in this context, and this is what I can expect if nothing changes. And that shift from possibility to probability is what makes clarity so decisive. Because once you see a pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. And more importantly, you can't pretend not to understand the implications of it. For the empath, this is often the moment where emotional attachment begins to loosen, not because they stopped caring, but because caring is no longer supported by a believable future. You know, the version of the relationship they were investing in, the one based on potential, no longer holds weight. What remains is the reality of what the relationship actually is, not what it could be. There's a kind of psychological sobriety in this phase. The empath is no longer influenced by isolated moments of kindness or temporary improvements. They're looking at the overall trajectory. They're assessing consistency, not intensity. And when they do that, the conclusion becomes difficult to ignore. Now, here's where this becomes uncomfortable for many people, because when clarity sets in, it removes the ambiguity that allows relationships to continue in an unstable state. As long as there's uncertainty, there's room to stay. But when the situation becomes clear, staying requires a conscious decision to accept what is not what could be. And for an empath who has already gone through accumulation and exhaustion, that's a decision they're no longer willing to make. So they begin to detach, and this detachment is not dramatic. It's quiet, deliberate, and often invisible to the other person at first. They stop overanalyzing. They stop trying to decode behavior. They stop looking for hidden meanings or deeper explanations, because from their perspective, the explanation is already sufficient. What you do consistently is who you are. That realization simplifies everything. It removes the need for further investigation, further conversation, further effort. And once that simplification happens, the relationship itself starts to feel less complex. Not because it improved, but because it's no longer being viewed through the lens of potential. It's being seen as it is. At this point, many people expect a confrontation. They assume that clarity will lead to a direct conversation, a final attempt to resolve things. But that assumption overlooks something important. Clarity doesn't always require expression. Sometimes it leads directly to action. Because from the empath's perspective, there's nothing left to clarify. They're not confused. They're not unsure. They're not seeking answers. They already have them. And when you already have the answers, the need for discussion diminishes significantly. So instead of explaining, they act, they reduce contact, they create distance, they stop investing, and eventually they remove themselves entirely, not out of anger, but out of alignment with what they now understand to be true. And this is where the final shift happens. The empath stops prioritizing the other person's potential and starts prioritizing their own reality. They recognize that staying in a situation that consistently contradicts their needs is not an act of loyalty. It's an act of denial. That recognition is what makes the decision irreversible. Because once you see clearly that something is not working, and more importantly that it is unlikely to change, continuing to engage with it requires you to ignore your own understanding. And for someone who has reached this level of clarity, that's no longer an option. So when the empath leaves at this stage, it feels final. Not because they're trying to make it final, but because internally the process is already complete. There's no ongoing debate, no lingering uncertainty, no part of them that is still hoping for a different outcome. Hope has been replaced by clarity, and clarity doesn't look back. And if there's one idea worth holding on to here, it's this. People don't walk away when they're confused. They walk away when they finally understand. By the time an empath reaches this final stage, something fundamental has already changed beneath the surface. It's not just that they're tired, and it's not just that they see clearly. It's that they've redefined what is acceptable in their life. And that redefinition centers around one concept that for most of their lives they either misunderstood or avoided altogether. Boundaries. For a long time, the empath equates compassion with endurance. They believe that being understanding means staying, that being kind means tolerating, and that being emotionally intelligent means finding a way to make things work no matter the cost. This creates a subtle but dangerous distortion, because in that framework, their value is measured by how much they can carry, not by how well they can protect themselves. So they become highly skilled at navigating other people's emotions, but underdeveloped in enforcing limits. They know how to de-escalate conflict, how to read between the lines, how to offer support in ways that make others feel seen. But when it comes to saying this is where it stops, there's hesitation. Not because they don't recognize the need for it, but because setting a boundary feels to them like withdrawing care. And that's the internal conflict. They're not afraid of losing people as much as they're uncomfortable with the idea of being the reason a connection changes. So instead of drawing clear lines, they extend themselves further. They compensate, they absorb, they adjust. And in doing so, they unintentionally teach others that access to them is unlimited. But over time, this becomes unsustainable. Because without boundaries, empathy turns into exposure. And exposure without protection leads to depletion. By the time the empath has moved through accumulation, exhaustion, and clarity, they are no longer operating from that original belief system. Experience has corrected it. They begin to understand something that isn't theoretically its earned. That compassion without structure invites imbalance. That being available at all times does not create deeper connection. It creates dependency, or in some cases disregard. And most importantly, they realize that if they don't define their limits, someone else will define them for them, usually in a way that benefits them, not the empath. This is where boundaries stop being optional and start becoming necessary. Now, here's what makes this stage so misunderstood from the outside. When an empath finally begins to set boundaries, they don't do it gradually in the way people expect. They don't ease into it with small adjustments or soft negotiations, because for them this isn't a minor behavioral shift. It's a complete recalibration of how they engage with the world. So when the boundary comes, it often appears absolute. They don't just reduce access, they remove it. They don't just limit conversation, they end it. They don't just create distance, they establish separation. And to someone who has only experienced their previous level of openness, this feels extreme. It feels disproportionate. It feels, in some cases, even cold. But what's actually happening is not an overreaction. It's a correction, because partial boundaries would require the empath to remain in a dynamic that is already proven to be harmful. But, and at this point in their development, they're no longer willing to negotiate with something that has consistently crossed the line. They've already tried flexibility. They've already tried understanding. They've already tried staying longer than they should have. So when they finally act, they act decisively. This is why the cutoff becomes their first real boundary, not because they prefer extremes, but because extremes are what finally break the pattern. It's the only form of boundary that doesn't rely on the other person's cooperation. It doesn't require them to change, to understand, or to agree. It simply removes the empath from the environment where the boundary was being violated. And that's an important distinction, because a boundary is not about controlling someone else's behavior. It's about controlling your own exposure to it. Once the empath understands this, their approach becomes much clearer. They stop trying to manage how others treat them and start deciding what they will and won't tolerate. And that shift from external control to internal authority is what makes the change permanent. There's also a philosophical layer here that often goes unspoken. When an empath begins to prioritize boundaries, they're not becoming less compassionate. They're becoming more accurate in how they apply that compassion. They're no longer distributing it indiscriminately. They're aligning it with environments